Today I'm going to talk about why we write. What's our motivation for writing? And in one way I don't think I need to do this talk, partly because people who write because they have to write. It's not something that's additional or extra. It's that sense that you have to tell somebody. You've found out something interesting and you have to tell them. It doesn't matter whether you've found out the plot of a novel or a story, or whether you've seen something exciting and interesting on television. When you find something new, you've got to tell somebody. And that kind of urge to tell is what drives us, I think. As researchers, we want to find new things to tell people so that we can tell them. And the way we tell people is we write about what we've learned. So why do we write? And let's have a look at that in some detail. Well, there's more than one reason for writing. The most obvious is to communicate what you found out, to put across to somebody your findings, to explain what you know that you think they need to know. But I think that seems obvious, but a book I have on my desk that was written by two former colleagues of mine, Gavin Fairbairn and David Cantor, and they wrote a book called Becoming an Author: Advice for Academics and Other Professionals. And they say something very interesting. Well, they say a lot of things very interesting, but the thing that struck me perhaps most forcefully was they say the difference between an experienced author and a novice author is that the novice author thinks you do the research, you find your findings, and then you think about writing them. But the experienced author, the writing is designed in from the beginning. What is it that you want to tell other people? And then you design your research to provide the evidence for what it is you wanted to tell people. I want to tell people that children in poverty suffer terrible disadvantages in schools, and I want to explain how that happens. I want to explain to people how casual racism occurs and disadvantages children from minorities in schools. I've got a story I want to tell, and then I'm going to look for the evidence that supports my case. Now, if I'm a conscientious researcher, I won't just look for evidence that supports my case. I'll go in with an open mind, an idea of what I will want to say, but I'm going to be prepared to be changed by the evidence. But designing in the writing from the beginning is a crucial aspect of being an experienced author. You're designing your research project with the thesis, with the article, with the book that's going to come out of it at the end in mind. You're designing what is it that people are going to want to know about this topic, and how am I going to find out about it in order to tell other people. So that's the first reason for wanting to write, that we want to write because we want to tell people we've found something out in our research, and we want to explain to other people what it is that we've found out. We've got that sense of excitement. We've got to tell people, we've got to explain. It's kind of a teaching urge, but coming back to the subtitle of the book by Cantor and Fairbairn, Advice for Academics and Other Professionals. And the point about this is that writing is part of being an effective communicator. And whatever field we go into, whatever professional life we pursue after we've graduated, once we've entered the workforce, to be an effective person, you need to be able to get your ideas across to other people. And that's most normally done effectively in reports that are punchy, that are focused, that draw on good evidence. Writing is part of presenting a case, is arguing your case, you're providing evidence for a course of action. Professional activity is based very much on writing. It's not always just writing. You may have to present it orally at a meeting of the company or your work team or your department, but you write the script that you're going to present orally, either on paper or in your head. You get it straight in order to communicate to other people. Now, I've been working in academic life for decades, and almost every course that I've taught, I have assessed. The assessment task has been to write an article 5,000 words, 5,000, 6,000 words long. Why do I choose that as the assignment that I set? Well, because it's the bread and butter of our life as academics. The journal article, you can't say anything very interesting in 2,000 words because you've got to have introduced the topic. You need 1,000 words to set the background, to explain why you're tackling this topic. You need 1,000 words to draw your conclusions, make your recommendations, point the lessons that you've learnt and have talked about in the article. The old adage, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them that you've told them. So if you've got an introduction and conclusion, each of about 1,000 words, 2,000 words isn't long enough to put some meat in that sandwich and make the article stand out as something strong, carrying a strong message. So you need something around 5,000, 6,000 words, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, but that's roughly the length at which you can say something interesting that you found out in your research. And sometimes we write at longer length, we write at greater length. We write a book because there's more than different aspects we've got. We've perhaps written 3 or 4 articles covering different aspects of a topic, and we bring them together to form a book, not necessarily the exact papers and the exact words, but we bring the ideas together to make a book because there's something more substantial that needs to be explained. And then once you've written your book, you might then come back to it again. Once you've written your thesis or dissertation, you may come back to it again and pick out shorter length pieces of work that you can present as articles for a journal. So writing is crucially about the message that you're carrying. The length of the document will depend on the weight, the importance, the complexity of the message that you're trying to communicate. But that's not the only reason that we write. I was, as I do, often use TED Talks in my teaching because they often encapsulate a sharp idea. And I came across this by Barry Schwartz, who's talking about his message. He's got 15 minutes in a TED Talk to communicate the message, and the topic that he's talking about is why having too much choice doesn't make people happier, it makes them less satisfied. But the content is not particularly important. He makes an aside comment about why he writes. Watch this. Watch Barry Schwartz talking about buying a new pair of jeans. There is a TED Talk by Barry Schwartz where he talks about the paradox of choice. The paradox that if you give people more choice, they aren't necessarily happier with the outcome than if they had a more restricted choice. And he says that he found that puzzling. And at one point he says he found it so puzzling that he wrote a book to explain it to himself. And that's another reason that people write. They write to get their ideas in order and to explain to themselves why they are finding something paradoxical, puzzling, a question of importance. Now, I think his expression is telling. He wrote a book to explain it to himself. And I understand exactly what it means. You've got an idea, you sit down and you write in order to get your ideas straight. You're explaining something to yourself, putting the argument in sequence, putting the pieces together so that they flow for you, so that you can understand it better. You can do this in your head without writing it down. But it's easier to cheat if you're not writing it down. If you're just thinking through, you might skip some steps in the argument. You might not be quite so logical as you think you are. If you write it down, you can come back, read over it, and very often you will discover something that you didn't know by writing it down to explain it to yourself. It's why you have to redraft work, because if you write something, you write the introduction, you write the text, you put down your argument, and you get to the end and you will see the whole argument in perspective. And that may mean that you know something at the end of writing it down that you didn't know at the beginning, and that probably means you could write a better introduction now than you could when you started. So a piece of work goes through several iterations as you explain to yourself, you understand the topic better, and you improve your understanding, and you can write it better when you go back to the beginning. The first draft is never going to be as good as something you could do later. That's difficult with a master's dissertation or a doctoral dissertation because it's a big document and it necessarily transforms as you go through. On the one hand, the finished document ought to look as though it was all written the day before the examination. It's the complete work, it's finished. But on the other hand, it will have evolved over maybe 2 years, 3 years, as you've done the research, you've collected the data, you've put the arguments together and discussed the quality of what you're doing. It's a living document. So there is a conflict here in whether the dissertation is a final product or whether it reflects the process of learning as you go through and explain to yourself. Something shorter, something like a journal article, ought to be polished. It ought to be a completed article. It ought to be the best thing that you can write. And so you need to go back and revise until you've got the quality of explanation that you want. Now, writing is not the only way you can do that. If you want to know that you've understood a concept clearly, teach it to somebody else. Because when you're teaching, any kind of slight misunderstandings, any ambiguities will surface immediately, and you'll see where you have to put in the extra work to understand your thinking better. So we write to explain things to ourselves, and that means, of course, if you're writing for yourself, you're not thinking about your audience. Once you've written for yourself, you then need to think about communicating with other people. Make sure that you're not using, you may use some shorthand, you may use acronyms, you may use all sorts of shortcuts and abbreviations but make sure you're not using jargon which other people can't understand. You need to be conscious of your audience when you're producing your finished document. And then the last motivation I want to think about for writing. Why do we write? Well, we write because we want something. We want something else. We want a degree. We want a qualification. We want a certificate. We want tenure. We want promotion. We want to meet the criteria that my contract may say I've got to write so many articles a year, that I've got to have published. If I'm going to graduate, I've got to have a certain number of publications. I'm very sure I'm not approve of that, because when I was doing my doctoral degree, there was no expectation that one would publish before one graduated. So, and I think that this is an unnecessary pressure that's put on students. But we often write to gain something else. And I want to say that's the worst possible reason for writing. We're in the situation we're in. To get tenure, to get promotion, to get your degree, you've got to do it. I understand you've got to write. But if you write just for that reason, if you just write for the purpose of getting a publication, you've got to have so many publications in order to graduate. If you do it just for that reason, frankly, it will show in your writing. You're not engaged with it, you're not excited about it, you're not trying to communicate something. We know as educators that intrinsic motivation is always much more effective than extrinsic motivation. Motivation to carry your message, motivation to explain yourself to yourself and to others, all of that's to do with the process of writing. It's intrinsic to writing that you're doing this. If you're doing it for something else that's extrinsic, you'll produce worse work. It will show in your work that you're doing it just to get another publication. There'll be nothing particularly original, no excitement in your writing. Don't do it. My adage on this is always, if you've got nothing to say, shut up. So if you've got nothing to say, don't write. Think first of all what it is you want to say, what it is you've got to tell people, what it is you must say, and then you'll produce the good work, and this will be achieved as a byproduct, not as a main purpose. Your main purpose in writing is to get your ideas straight. This is the process of writing, and to tell other people and communicate with other people what it is you've learned, what it is you've discovered. And incidentally, because you get so much out of sorting your ideas into a good order, it's why you can't subcontract that job out to artificial intelligence. You can't use ChatGPT or any of the other large language models to write your article for you, because if you do that, you're missing the most exciting part of the writing process, which is getting your ideas in order. By all means, ask ChatGPT to write you a paragraph on this topic, or tell it what it is you're trying to say, and ask the AI to put it in better order or whatever it is. But it's you that has to understand. It's you that has to look at the work, look at the product that comes from AI and say, oh yeah, that's what I understand. I now understand this clearly. I could explain this over a cup of coffee with a friend because I'm really clear in my own mind. it's a conversation you're having with artificial intelligence. It's not the product that you're interested in. If you're only interested in the product, by all means use AI. You'll produce rubbish and it'll be a dull article and no one will read it. If you wanted to produce something that people are going to notice and people are going to read, make sure you've understood it, make sure it's the best you can produce, and make sure that it's designed to engage with the people that you want to read it. So that's the question of writing. We write for ourselves, we write for other people. Writing is an integral part of the process we're going through in academia, and if we're lucky, we'll gain something else. I have to say, I've never gained money from writing things. I've written books, I've written articles, and except in a very few occasions have not made money out of those articles and books, but they've given me a good life, an opportunity to work in jobs that I've enjoyed with people that I like, and so the rewards are there. You do get something from writing, not great wealth surely, but you get something from writing, but you get it most if it's to satisfy yourself and to satisfy your need to communicate with other people.